This birthday is burned into me, not because of a party or cake or candles, but because my son looked me straight in the eye and told me to get out of his life. He didn't raise his voice, didn't get emotional, just said it like a man reading a sentence that had already been written. The cafe around us carried on as if nothing had happened. Cups clinking, milk steam hissing, while my world shifted an inch to the left and locked there. I'd expected something that day, but not those exact words. Still, I didn't flinch. I'd been ready for this moment for weeks, whether I wanted it or not. Michael leaned back in his chair, scanning the street through the window. "It's better this way," he added, almost as an afterthought. I stood, sliding my chair back without a sound. My coat was already in my hand. "All right," I said, calm as stone. "If that's what you want." Outside, the cold March air cut through me, but I welcomed it. My phone was in my hand before the door shut behind me. I scrolled to a number I'd kept ready and pressed call. 1 ring. 2. "This is Harris." "It's time," I said. A pause. Then, "Understood." I hung up, slid the phone back into my pocket, and walked away without looking over my shoulder. The trap had been set for weeks. Now it was closing. 3 weeks earlier, I'd started to see the cracks. Small at first, then impossible to ignore. 3 weeks before my birthday, I'd already started watching him. Not because I wanted to. God knows I'd have preferred to believe nothing was wrong. But because the signs were piling up like storm clouds. It started with a phone call from an old friend in the department. "Saw your boy at the Riverside Diner," Harris had said, his voice casual but edged. "He was with Tommy Blake." "You remember Tommy?" I remembered. Tommy had been a low-level hustler since high school, the kind of man who never worked a legitimate day in his life. Drugs, stolen goods, whatever would pay for his next night out. And my son was meeting him for coffee? That was my first knot of suspicion. Then came the withdrawals. I wasn't looking for them, but Michael had left a bank statement on my kitchen counter after borrowing my printer. 5 withdrawals in a single week, each for exactly $900. Small enough to avoid triggering federal reports, big enough to be more than pocket change. "Business stuff," he'd said when I asked. But Michael didn't have a business. That's when I decided I needed to know the truth, whether I liked it or not. I'd spent 25 years in law enforcement before I retired. You don't shake the habits, the way you notice patterns, the way you can tell when someone's lying by the set of their jaw. My son was lying. I started small. Casual visits to his apartment, always with some excuse. A bag of groceries, a tool he'd asked to borrow. I'd watch where his eyes went when I stepped inside. They always darted to the hall closet. One evening, while he was in the shower, I forgot my wallet in the kitchen and doubled back. I opened the closet. Inside was a black duffel bag, half-zipped, stuffed with rolled bills and manila envelopes. One of them had my handwriting on it. An old envelope from when I'd helped him with rent years ago. That was the first real crack in the ground beneath us. I didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, I called Harris. We'd been partners for a decade before I retired, and I trusted him as much as anyone still wearing a badge. "I think my son's involved in something," I told him, "and I don't want him to know I know." Harris didn't waste words. "You want me to run him?" "No, not yet. Just be ready. I'll get you what you need." From then on, every meeting with Michael had a second purpose. Every coffee, every dinner, every just stopping by was a way to gather more. I'd slip a voice recorder into my jacket pocket. I'd note license plates of cars parked outside his place. One afternoon, I saw him at a gas station, laughing with 2 men I recognized from old case files, both with priors for armed robbery. They drove off together in a silver SUV with stolen plates. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I already knew where this was heading. By the second week, I had enough to hand over. Photos, dates, times, descriptions. Harris didn't say much when I gave him the folder, just a grim nod and, "We'll need him in the open, somewhere public." That's when I picked my birthday. Michael wouldn't expect a trap on a day like that. He'd think I was just another old man wanting a little attention from his son. And when the time came, I'd be looking him in the eye when he finally revealed exactly who he'd become. The plan was set. Now all I had to do was wait. The week before my birthday, Harris called. He never wasted breath on small talk. "Your son's in deep, Jack," he said. "We've been watching the people he's been meeting. These aren't casual friendships. He's been acting as a middleman, moving stolen goods, laundering cash through small-time fronts." The words sat heavy in my gut. I'd known it was bad, but not this bad. "You've got enough to bring him in now?" "Not yet. We need him touching the product. Possession will lock it down airtight. Without it, he can play dumb, say he didn't know what was in the bags." I stared at the wall of my study. On the desk was a framed photo of Michael at age 10, grinning with a missing front tooth, holding up the fish we'd caught at Lake Arrowhead. That boy was gone. In his place was a man who kept duffel bags full of dirty money in his closet. "How close?" I asked. "Close enough that I'd suggest keeping your distance unless you want to be in the middle when it happens." But keeping my distance wasn't part of the plan. I needed to look him in the eye one more time. I needed to know that when the cuffs clicked, he understood who had set the chain in motion. 2 days later, I got my answer without asking. It was late, just after 10 p.m., when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Your boy's slipping. Thought you'd want to know." Attached was a blurry photo. Michael, standing outside a warehouse on the east side, talking to Tommy Blake. In Tommy's hands was a cardboard box sealed with packing tape, the kind I'd seen 1,000 times in evidence rooms. I called Harris. "He's touching product. Tonight." "Yeah, I'll send you the photo." Harris's tone changed, sharper now, all business. "All right, we'll be ready. If you can keep him in one place for 30 minutes on Friday, we'll take it from there." Friday. My birthday. That's when the final piece slid into place. I'd invite no one else. Just me and Michael. He'd think it was about reconciliation, maybe even a guilt trip. I'd let him set the tone. If he wanted to cut ties, I'd give him the space and the rope to do it. On Thursday night, I sat at my kitchen table, the recorder in front of me, the battery fully charged. I decided to wear the same jacket I'd worn to his high school graduation. Sentimental enough that he'd never think to search it. I thought about the moment that was coming. Not the arrest. That was Harris's business. But the instant Michael would realize I wasn't the oblivious old man he'd been treating like a background prop in his new life. I didn't want revenge. Not exactly. I wanted clarity. For him and maybe for me. There's a moment in every investigation when the suspect knows the game is over. I'd seen it 100 times in interview rooms. That sag in the shoulders. That empty stare. The knowledge that every step they've taken has been toward the very trap they now find themselves in. By the time I went to bed, my plan was sealed tighter than a search warrant envelope. Tomorrow I'd meet my son for lunch. He'd tell me to leave his life, and I'd give him exactly what he asked for. Only he wouldn't be walking away from me. He'd be walking straight into Harris's arms. The morning of my birthday was sharp and clear, the kind of early spring day that tricks you into thinking winter's finally gone. I woke before the alarm, the old habit from my years on the job, and stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee. From my driveway, I could see the quiet street. Across the road, a maroon sedan I didn't recognize sat idling. I didn't need to check the plate. I already knew Harris had his people in position. I moved through the motions of the morning as if I were any other retired man starting another ordinary day. Shower, shave, dress. The jacket was already laid out on the back of the chair in my study, the one I'd worn to Michael's graduation. I slipped the small voice recorder into the inside pocket, the red light winking once before going dark. Fully charged. At 10 a.m., Harris called. "We're set. Surveillance has been on him since dawn. He met with Blake again last night." I didn't ask for details. The less I knew about the mechanics, the cleaner my role stayed. "You'll be at the cafe? We've got eyes across the street. You keep him talking. When he leaves, don't follow. We'll handle it." I hung up and sat for a while in my quiet kitchen, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. There was a weight to this morning, heavier than any birthday before it. Not because of the number, I'd stopped counting those years ago, but because of what it would mark. Today wasn't about cake or candles. Today was about ending something. At 11:30, I locked the front door and slid behind the wheel of my truck. The drive into town was uneventful. Small shops preparing for the lunchtime rush, the bakery unloading trays of bread, a couple walking their dog along Main Street. Life carrying on, oblivious. I pulled into a parking space 2 doors down from the cafe. Checked my watch. 5 minutes early. Good. Through the cafe's big front window, I could already see him. Michael sat alone at a corner table, his phone flat on the wood, hands clasped in front of him. His shoulders were tight, his gaze flicking toward the street every few seconds. It wasn't the posture of a man here to celebrate his father's birthday. It was the posture of someone waiting for news, or maybe for an ending. I stayed in the truck another minute, watching him, and felt the last trace of doubt drain away. This was the right decision. He wasn't the boy from that Lake Arrowhead photo. He wasn't the young man I'd loaned my car to for job interviews. He'd crossed into something darker, and he'd chosen to stay there. At 11:58, I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the door. The bell above it chimed when I entered, the warm scent of coffee washing over me. Michael looked up. For a moment, something like a smile flickered across his face, but it never reached his eyes. I crossed the room, sat down, and set my hat on the table. "Happy birthday," he said flatly. I nodded, folding my hands. "Let's skip the pleasantries. What's on your mind?" He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and I knew before he spoke that we were about to reach the moment. The one I'd been building toward for weeks. "Dad," he said, "I think it's time you left my life." I didn't flinch, didn't ask why, just glanced at my watch, right on schedule, and reached for my coat. When I stepped outside a minute later, the black sedan was still there, its engine running. My thumb found Harris's number. "It's time," I said. When I turned the corner away from the cafe, I didn't look back. That was the hardest part. Every instinct told me to watch. But I knew Harris's crew didn't need me shadowing Michael. My job was done. Still, my mind played the scene over in crisp detail. Michael leaning back in his chair, delivering that line like he'd been rehearsing it. He thought he was cutting me out for good. In reality, he'd just signed the warrant with his own mouth. I walked a block east and ducked into McKenna's Hardware. The place smelled of sawdust and oil, a comfort I hadn't realized I'd missed. I pretended to browse socket wrenches, keeping my phone in my palm. Harris had promised an update when it happened. At 12:21, the first vibration came, a single buzz. "He's on the move." No other details. That was how Harris worked. I pictured it. Michael leaving the cafe, slipping his phone into his pocket, heading toward his car. Somewhere along the way, he'd make contact. Maybe Blake would hand off another box. Maybe it would be one of the other players I'd seen him with at the gas station. The exchange wouldn't take long. It never did. Another buzz. Meeting confirmed. East lot behind Franklin Supply. Franklin Supply was 3 blocks from the cafe, an industrial hardware distributor with a loading dock that backed onto an alley. Perfect for a quick, dirty handoff. I knew Harris would already have unmarked units in position. I kept my pace slow, still pretending to browse. On the far wall, a dusty display of padlocks caught my eye. Rows of steel and brass, each promising to keep the wrong people out. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my life locking things down, protecting people from the trouble outside. Somewhere along the line, trouble had walked right through my own front door. At 12:32, the third buzz came. This one lingered longer, the phone dancing against my palm. I stepped into an empty aisle and read the message. Contact made. Moving in. The image in my mind was sharper now. Michael and Blake standing in the shade of the loading dock, a cardboard box between them. 2 uniforms closing from the alley. Another pair stepping from the open bay door. Badges out, voices firm. A 4th buzz. Cuffed. No resistance. That was it. 3 weeks of quiet watching, of biting my tongue, of letting him think he'd fooled me. All condensed into those 4 words. I didn't feel the rush I thought I might. No satisfaction, no vindication. Just a slow, heavy exhale. The kind you take after carrying something too long. I left the hardware store without buying a thing. The maroon sedan from that morning had relocated to the far corner of the lot. One figure in the driver's seat, another talking into a radio. As I passed, the driver lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in a brief nod. I returned it. By the time I reached my truck, my phone buzzed again. This time a call. Harris's voice was steady. "It's done. We found more than enough in the box. He's going to county tonight. We'll process him there." I leaned against the truck door. "You'll tell him that it was you?" Harris paused. "Do you want me to?" I thought about that for a long moment. The part of me that was still his father wanted to say no, to keep my face out of his mind when the cell door closed. But another part, the part that remembered the duffel bag in the closet, the lies, the choice he made this morning, knew the truth. "Yeah," I said finally. "Tell him." There was a short chuckle on the line. "He's not going to like it." "No," I said, climbing into the truck. "But he'll understand it." Harris called again that evening just after sunset. I'd been sitting in my study, the house quiet except for the low hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. The light outside had gone that deep indigo that makes everything look softer, except for what Harris was about to tell me. "They booked him at 417, Harris said. "Possession of stolen property, conspiracy to distribute. We got photos of him with the goods, fingerprints on the packaging, and Blake's already trying to cut a deal. He'll give up your son to save his own skin." I let the words settle. Charges like that weren't a slap on the wrist. They were the kind that could carve years out of a man's life. "Did you tell him?" "I did." Harris's tone shifted, heavier now. I waited until the paperwork was done. He was sitting in holding, staring at the wall. Wouldn't talk to anyone. When I walked in, he figured I was there to explain bail procedures or give him the usual speech. I could picture it clearly. Michael in that steel chair, the cinder-block walls, the faint echo of voices from other cells. "I told him we'd been watching him for weeks," Harris continued. "That every meeting, every box, every conversation we could pin down was on record. Then I told him who started it." I said nothing. Harris let the silence hang a beat longer before adding. He didn't say a word at first, just blinked a couple times. Then he laughed. Short, bitter. "Of course it was him," he said. Then he leaned back and muttered something I didn't catch. "Wouldn't look at me after that." I felt that in my chest. Not because I'd hoped for gratitude, God no, but because I recognized that laugh. I'd heard it when he was a teenager and thought he was too clever for house rules. The sound of someone realizing the game was over but refusing to admit defeat. "What happens now?" I asked. "He'll see the public defender in the morning. Given the evidence, the DA will push for a plea deal. But if Blake hands over enough, they might tack on more charges." Harris paused. "You did the right thing, Jack. This could have gone a lot worse." I thought about that. Worse, yes, he could have been caught in a bad deal that turned violent. He could have ended up in a morgue instead of a holding cell. But knowing I'd stopped him didn't make it easier to swallow the image of my son in an orange jumpsuit. After we hung up, I stayed in the study a long time. The house was still, the way it had been every night since Maria passed. On the wall across from my desk hung a shadow box with my old badge, the one I'd worn for 25 years. Beneath it, the commendations I'd been given for cases closed, for people saved. Tonight, none of them felt like accomplishments. Because no matter how many criminals I'd put away in my career, I'd never imagined the day my own son would join them. I poured a measure of bourbon into a glass and sat by the window. Outside, the streetlights blinked on, one by one, washing the road in pale yellow. Somewhere across town, Michael was counting the hours until morning. And I was counting the years since the boy in that Lake Arrowhead photo had started to disappear. The morning after the arrest, I woke earlier than usual. Habit, I thought at first, but as I sat on the edge of the bed, I realized it was the weight in my chest that pulled me out of sleep. The kind of weight you can't roll over and escape from. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the steam. Across the street, Mrs. Daly was walking her dog, same as every morning. She gave a little wave when she saw me through the window, but her eyes lingered. News travels fast in a town like ours. By mid-morning, the phone started ringing. First it was Harris with a procedural update. Arraignment set for Monday, bail unlikely given the charges. Then it was my sister in Tacoma, voice thick with disbelief. Jack, I just don't understand. How did it get this far? I didn't have an answer. The truth was, it hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow drift, years in the making, and I'd been too willing to excuse the signs. The rest of the day was a steady drip of calls. Old colleagues, neighbors, even the pastor from St. Luke's. Some were fishing for details, others offering condolences like there'd been a death. In a way, there had. The boy they remembered, the one who used to mow lawns in the summer to buy baseball cards, was gone. Around noon, Harris stopped by in person. He stood in my doorway, hands in his coat pockets. Blake's rolling over hard. Says Michael handled at least 6 transfers in the last 3 months. We've got him on camera for 4 of them. DA smiling ear to ear. I nodded, but didn't invite him in. Harris read my face. You okay? I will be, I said. It was the truth, but it felt hollow coming out. That night, the first letter came. Not from Michael. He didn't have the time or the materials to write yet. But from his lawyer. A plain white envelope, return address stamped with the County Public Defender's Office. Inside was a single sheet of paper requesting a meeting to discuss family support in upcoming legal proceedings. Family support. That was the polite way of saying bail money or testimony to soften the blow. I folded the letter back into the envelope and set it on the hall table, unopened beyond the first glance. On the 3rd day, the call came. A recorded voice told me I was receiving a collect call from Michael, followed by a beep. I stared at the phone until it went silent. No message was left. There's no voicemail from county jail. But the absence spoke louder than anything he might have said. By Friday, a week after my birthday, the rhythm of the neighborhood was back to normal. The mailman made his rounds. Kids rode bikes past my house. But for me, normal was gone. I found myself in the garage that afternoon, opening old boxes, looking for something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. In the bottom of one, beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers, I found the tackle box from our Lake Arrowhead trips. Inside, the lures were still arranged in neat rows, little flashes of color under the dust. I sat there a long time, holding one between my fingers, remembering the boy who used to brag about catching the biggest fish in the lake, even when it was barely longer than his hand. That boy wouldn't have needed a father to set him up for arrest. The man he'd become did. It was 9 days after my birthday when I finally decided to go. Not because I'd softened, not because I thought seeing him would somehow fix what had been broken for years, but because I wanted to look him in the eye without a table, without a box of stolen cash between us. County jail has a smell you never forget. Antiseptic over sweat, stale air trapped in concrete. I'd walked through those doors 100 times in my career, always on the other side of the law. This time was different. The deputy at reception didn't need to ask my name. Harris had already cleared me. Visitations in 15, she said, sliding a plastic badge across the counter. I clipped it to my shirt pocket and followed her through 2 sets of steel doors that clanged shut behind me. The visitation room was a row of booths divided by cloudy plexiglass. I sat at one, the black phone hanging from its cord beside me, and waited. When Michael walked in, the first thing I noticed was how much older he looked. County time will do that. It shrinks you from the inside out. He wore the standard orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed at the waist. No swagger now, just a slow shuffle to the seat opposite mine. He picked up the phone without meeting my eyes. You didn't answer my call. I didn't have anything to say, I replied. My voice sounded flat, even to me. He finally looked up, and there it was, the mix of anger and disbelief. You set me up. I leaned forward. I gave the police what they needed to stop you before you got yourself killed. You set you up. He shook his head, the cuff chain rattling softly. You think you're some hero? Harris told me you'd been watching me for weeks. Sneaking around like I'm a suspect. You were a suspect. I cut in. Still are. And I didn't sneak. I gave you every chance to tell me the truth. You didn't take it. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint hum of the ventilation system. His jaw worked, but no words came out. Finally, he said, "I'm your son. You were my son long before you became a criminal," I said quietly. "That's the difference." He looked away, staring at some fixed point beyond the plexiglass. "Blake says I can get a deal. Couple years, maybe less if I give them names." "That's between you and the DA," I said. "I'm not here to negotiate for you. I'm here to tell you that whatever time they give you, you're going to serve it. And when you get out, it's on you to decide who you're going to be." Silence again. I remembered him at 10 years old, sitting on the edge of the dock at Lake Arrowhead, kicking his feet in the water and asking if I thought he'd ever catch a fish bigger than mine. Back then, I'd lied and said yes. The deputy's voice came over the speaker. "Time's up." Michael hung up the phone, stood, and let the guard lead him away. He didn't look back. I stayed seated for a moment longer, the phone still warm in my hand. Then I set it down gently, stood, and walked out past the same steel doors, the badge on my chest feeling heavier than it had when I came in. Outside, the afternoon sun hit my face, and I realized I hadn't taken a full breath in the entire 20 minutes I was in there. The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and paper. I'd spent too many years in places like this, watching justice roll out in all its slow, grinding inevitability. Today, I was in the second row, directly behind the prosecution's table, my badge long gone but my posture still that of a man on duty. Michael came in through the side door, shackled at the ankles. The orange jumpsuit had been traded for a plain gray shirt and slacks provided by the jail, but it didn't make him look any less like an inmate. His eyes swept the room, pausing when they found me. For a moment I thought I saw something. Regret. Maybe, but it was gone before I could name it. The judge, an older woman with a voice like steel wrapped in velvet, read through the charges. Possession of stolen property. Conspiracy to distribute. 6 counts tied directly to the Blake operation. She spoke each one like a hammer on wood, each syllable falling into the record. The DA outlined the evidence. Surveillance photos, bank records, recorded conversations. Blake had already taken a plea deal and given testimony that put Michael in the middle of every transaction. When it was the defense's turn, the public defender stood and did what he could. Mentioned Michael's age, no prior violent offenses, potential for rehabilitation. I'd heard the speech before, delivered for men far less guilty. Michael didn't speak until the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. He cleared his throat, glanced at me once more and said, "I made mistakes, bad choices, but I'm not the only one involved. I just hope someday people see me for more than this." The judge nodded, her face unreadable. "Mr. Lawson, this court sentences you to 6 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 4. Given the nature of the offenses and the cooperation of your co-defendant, this is leniency." The gavel struck once. Just like that, it was over. Michael's shoulders sagged, but he didn't turn to look at me as the deputies let him out. The chain at his ankles clinked against the floor in a slow, steady rhythm. I stayed seated until the room emptied, the echo of that gavel still in my ears. Outside, the air was crisp. Harris was leaning against the hood of an unmarked car. "Could have been worse," he said. "Could have been better," I replied. He studied me for a moment. "You going to visit him in state?" I shook my head. "That's his time to serve, not mine." We stood there a while in silence, watching the courthouse steps clear. People came and went, lawyers with files tucked under their arms, families clustered together. Most of them didn't know what it felt like to hand their own blood over to the system. When Harris finally drove off, I stayed a moment longer, looking up at the courthouse windows. Somewhere behind one of them, Michael had been told exactly how much of his life he'd just lost, and I'd been reminded how much of mine I'd already given up trying to save him. A week after the sentencing, my birthday card from the hardware store arrived in the mail, one of those automatic things they send to valued customers. It sat on the kitchen table unopened for 2 days before I finally tore it open. $5 off your next purchase. I tossed it in the drawer with the spare batteries. The house was quiet, the way it always was now. No phone ringing with collect calls from the jail, no knock on the door from the public defender. Michael was already on the transfer list for state. 4 years if he kept his head down. 6 if he didn't. That morning, I walked down to the lake. The air had that early spring chill, enough to sting the lungs but not enough to keep the fishermen away. A few were already out in boats, their voices carrying faintly over the water. I sat on the old dock, the same spot where Michael and I used to fish when he was just a boy. Back then, he'd run down the planks barefoot, tackle box in one hand, rod in the other, grinning like the world couldn't touch him. I could still hear his voice in my head. "Dad, I'm gonna catch the biggest one today." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out one of those old lures from the dusty tackle box in the garage. The paint was chipped, the metal a little dull, but it still caught the light when I turned it. I held it in my palm for a while, letting the memories come and go. People like to think the hardest part of being a parent is letting your kids go. They're wrong. The hardest part is knowing when you have to push them away for their own good. On my birthday, my son told me to leave his life. What he didn't understand was that I'd already made that choice weeks earlier, when I saw the man he'd become. The arrest was just the last page of a story I'd been writing in silence. I stood and tossed the lure into the water. It disappeared with a small splash, the ripples spreading out until they were gone. Some things, once let go, don't come back. As I walked back up the hill toward home, I thought about the word gift. People wrap them in paper, tie them with ribbons, smile as they're given. But sometimes a gift isn't something you hand over. Sometimes it's something you take away, the chance for someone to destroy themselves before it's too late. That was my gift to Michael. He'll never thank me for it. I don't expect him to. But maybe, years from now, when the cell door finally opens and the air smells like freedom again, he'll understand. And maybe that will be enough.